A most warm welcome to you, friends. My name, for those of you who don't know me, is Diane Matheson Jimenez. I use she, her pronouns, and it is my great honor to serve as Communities of Faith Support Minister to Canadian Shield and Shining Waters Regional Councils. To begin us this evening in a good way, I would like to acknowledge the territory I join you from and to acknowledge those who have cared for the land over the years. I'm joining you this evening from my home in Brantford, which is part of the Haldimand Tract that encompasses 6 miles on either side of the Grand River. And this land has been home to many peoples, and particularly this evening, I give thanks for the stewardship of the Haudenosaunee, the Anishinaabe, and the Chonatan peoples. When we gather in this way from many different places, we'll often use the chat box to name the territory where we're joining from, or to acknowledge the original caretakers of the land. And so if you feel so moved, I would welcome you to use the chat box to name the lands where you're joining from and to acknowledge the people who have stewarded the lands over the years. I would also invite you to use the chat box to reflect on your personal commitment, or maybe your community of faith's commitment to reconciling relationships. So in my case, when I went to school, up until about the time I was in university, when I took a specific Indigenous studies class, I learned a very sanitized version of a contact and Indigenous settler relations. And so one of my commitments to reconciliation is teaching my own children facts, even and especially when those facts are really hard to talk about. And so if you feel so moved, please use the chat as you are doing, name the territory, give thanks to the stewards of the land, and to name your commitment to right relations. Several weeks ago, my colleagues Melody and Jody and I had a conversation about duty of care, and as a result of that meeting, we sent out correspondence to ask who might be interested in attending a webinar on duty of care. In a very short period of time, 200 of you registered and expressed how badly needed a workshop on this topic was. Since that time, an undisclosed number of you forgot to register, but asked if you could come anyway, so we know that this is a critical conversation for us to be having at this time. We also know in an hour and a half, we can only scratch the surface. And so after the event, our amazing administrative team will circulate an evaluation asking for your feedback, and in particular, what are the topics that you would like to see us address next? We look forward to continuing this conversation. The agenda for tonight was circulated in advance. We are going to ground our time in scripture before a presentation on duty of care and a second presentation on the sexual misconduct policy. We're then going to move into a time of self-directed breakout groups, and some direction will be given about that a little bit later on. After our time in breakout, we will come back together for final thoughts and a blessing. So to ground us, I'm going to share words from John 21, verses 15 to 17. And when they had finished eating, Jesus said to Simon Peter, "Simon, son of John, do you love me more than these?" And by these, he was referring to the other disciples. "Yes, Lord," he said, "you know that I love you." Jesus said, "Feed my lambs." Again, Jesus said, "Simon, son of John, do you love me?" He answered, "Yes, Lord, you know that I love you." Jesus said, "Take care of my sheep." The third time he said to him, "Simon, son of John, do you love me?" And now at this point, Peter was hurt because Jesus had asked him 3 times, "Do you love me?" He said, "Lord, you know all things. You know that I love you." Jesus said, "Feed my sheep." Holy words, holy wisdom. Thanks be to God. When we talk about duty of care, and particularly a theology of care, it's equal parts as simple and as complex as taking care of the shepherd's beloved lambs. We are called to love and care for one another as we have been loved and cared for. Duty of care can mean so many things and have so many implications, but at the heart of it all, it is all about doing all that we can reasonably do to protect the people in our congregations and communities and the buildings that we worship in from harm. There's a common idea that duty of care is only about protecting the vulnerable, and we sometimes name children, the elderly, folks who are immunocompromised. But the truth is that when we enter into a worshiping community in any capacity, we all bring all of our vulnerabilities with us. And as such, we have a responsibility to care for one another and for our churches, that we might continue to experience hospitality and fellowship in spaces and in places that are as safe as we can possibly make them. And so at this point, I'm going to turn us over to Jody, who is going to give us an introduction to duty of care. Thanks, Jody.
Thank you, Diane. So my name is Jody Maltby, and I use the pronouns she, her. I'm part of the staff team in Shining Waters Regional Council, although I keep sneaking into Canadian Shield because I like you guys up there so much too. So I'm really pleased whenever we gather together. And I am going to cross my fingers and share my screen that this will all come together. And you can see that? Perfect. So I'm starting with the deep stuff. What are our legal obligations as a community of faith within the United Church of Canada? And one of the questions that we received for this workshop asked, is it more important to act based on our faith or based on rules? And we like to believe that because we are a community of faith, good Christians, that we all have one another's best interests at heart. But sadly, we know that this is not always true. Abuse can and does occur in the church, and we've not always been willing or able to respond both justly and pastorally, nor have we been proactive in reducing the risk that abuse may happen in our programs. We are communities of faith, but we are also an institution that can and will be held legally responsible for the actions of our employees and our volunteers. So duty of care as a legal principle is about understanding the relationship that exists between two people or between a person and the church or the community of faith, and our obligation within that relationship to exercise reasonable care for the other person, including protecting them from harm. As church leaders, both staff and volunteers, we carry that responsibility individually, but also collectively as leadership teams. We have the responsibility to show that we have reasonably done everything in our power to prevent abuse from occurring. So this is called our due diligence. It's also a legal principle. And our hope is that this workshop gives us the tools to do this. Our best defense legally is to have clear policies and practices for duty of care and to follow those policies and practices. So the United Church offers a number of resources for duty of care, and you can find them on the United Church's website. And I'm going to put this link in the chat for you. And that will take you to a number of the duty of care resources that are available on the website. But the really key one from the website that I'm going to be relying on is Faithful Footsteps. And I'm just putting that into the chat as well for you. There it is. So it's Faithful Footsteps. And Faithful Footsteps shouldn't be confused with Faithful Footprints. So if you see me pause occasionally, it's because I want to make sure I get the right one. Faithful Footsteps, which we're talking about tonight, is about screening volunteers. Faithful Footprints is about the reduction of carbon emissions, which is also an important topic. So Faithful Footsteps is a handbook that explains screening processes for volunteers. We often think that screening means police record checks, and certainly they are a part of screening, but they are not the only tool in the toolbox, nor are they the first one that we should use. So because this is an introductory workshop, I'm going to highlight in broad strokes, and I encourage all of you to read Faithful Footsteps and the other resources that are available on the website. And as Diane mentioned, we are going to offer ongoing workshops to delve more deeply into particular aspects of duty of care. But this is really intended as an overview to get us all thinking about this topic. And the other resource that I am relying on is called Plan to Protect, a Safeguarding Guide for Children, Youth, and Adults, Church Edition. It's a pretty big book, you'll see, and it's probably more than most of you need. But if you are a large program church with lots of staff or lots of volunteers and programs, this may be a good investment. And you can find a link for ordering it on that United Church website that I showed you earlier. And that brings another point up that was raised in some of the questions we received. And that is that duty of care looks very different in a small family church versus a large program church, or a rural church versus an urban church versus a downtown Toronto or Sudbury church. Congregations are as different as the buildings that house them. And that's why we can't provide a one-size-fits-all duty of care plan. We each need to do the work in our own particular context. And just to sort of make it more concrete, I was thinking about two communities of faith that I've participated in. One, when I was a few years younger than I am now, was a smaller, more rural church that had a small sanctuary with a single open room underneath with a kitchen and a bathroom off of it. And they offered a one-class Sunday school, which I taught. They had a UCW unit, and they had a choir that rehearsed on Sunday mornings. So duty of care in that context was very different than another congregation I was part of that has 3 floors, multiple rooms, and big rooms and small rooms and little nooks and crannies. And it's very possible to walk into that building and leave that building and nobody ever knows you've been there. So when we're thinking about duty of care, we really need to focus on the context that we are in. And a key tool that we want to employ in doing our duty of care work, and the one that I hope you'll really focus on as a first step if this is a new process for you, is a risk assessment. And assessing risk means taking care to consider the possibility that something could go wrong, and then taking steps to stop, minimize, prevent, or eliminate the circumstances which may lead to injury, abuse, or harm. Risk management means accepting the fact that harm is possible. And part of our role as church leaders is to review and assess programs we offer and determine what risks might be possible in those programs, and then how can we minimize them. And this could be done by your church board or council, or it could be a committee that's responsible for the program, like Christian education, outreach, pastoral care, whatever group in your community of faith has oversight of the program. So when we think about the factors that we need to consider in determining risk, one of the first ones is, in fact, how vulnerable are the participants. Consider their age, consider their dependency, their physical, mental, spiritual well-being and ability, their gender and sexual orientation, and any other factors that may make people more vulnerable. Consider whether participants are ever alone with a leader or a volunteer. Consider the setting. Does the program occur in a public space within your church building where lots of people may be walking through, or is it a private space? And if it's a private space, and there's a door, is there a window in the door? Is it a space that people can easily see into? Does the activity occur in the church property, or is it off-site? Is it in a public building? Is it in a private home? Is the activity carried out in a group, or is it one-on-one? And what's the nature of the activity? Is it a youth group going rock climbing, or is it a book study? Is there an expectation of privacy, for example, a hospital visit? How will the activity be supervised? Is there more than one leader? Have the leaders been trained? If there's only one leader, are there random spot checks during the activity? Are there other people around in the building? Again, how much interaction is there with people beyond the individual leader? And then what is the nature of the relationship between the participants and the leader? Is there a power differential? Is the leader in a position of trust? Understanding the risk involved in any particular program that you're offering can then help us to determine the kind of screening, training, and supervision that's needed to make those activities as safe as possible for everyone who's involved. So, if you've assessed your program and it's an adult choir rehearsal led by a volunteer choir director, everyone's always together in a group, it's an open public space in the church building with lots of other meetings going on around it, you might consider that the risk is low and it's a risk that it's comfortable to assume. But if that same volunteer choir director is working with a small children's choir, the risk might feel higher. You might decide that it would be helpful to have another adult always present with the group. Or if that same volunteer is teaching Sunday school in a room that has a closed door, you might want to consider either leaving the door partially open or having a window installed in the door, and have another volunteer who makes random visits through the Sunday school area, checking into the rooms. So you might modify the activity. If your volunteers are home visitors or visiting in care facilities, you might decide that it's always wise to have two visitors who are at arm's length from each other, meaning that they're not spouses or siblings or BFFs. And again, this could help to minimize the risk in that particular program. A lot of churches have volunteers who drive people to church, and in assessing the risk for that program, you might decide that you want to pay for taxis or hire a bus service, and this would transfer the liability to someone else who has professional expertise with that particular program. And if the activity was rock climbing with youth, as we discussed earlier, you may decide that the risk is too high and you want to choose a different activity. Or you may decide to go ahead, in which case you'll want to check with your insurer to see if you need additional coverage to help minimize the risk assumed by the church. So there are lots of options to respond to the risk once you've determined what risk is involved. And I want to be clear about a couple of things. And the first is that when we're doing risk assessment, the decision should never be person-centered, in the sense that we don't say, oh, it's fine here because we trust Joe, or these are good kids, so there's no risk. Or alternatively, oh, we don't trust Jane, so we think there may be a risk here. We assess the risk on the basis of the program, and then we invite volunteers into the positions with a full understanding of the risk. And that's a really important point. We don't want people thinking that we're responding to specific individuals, or that it only applies, duty of care only applies if we are uncertain about specific individuals. Duty of care is a process that we should use all the time in every program. And the second thing I want to say is that duty of care does help to protect the participants, but it also protects leaders from the risk of unfounded claims that can't be disproved. And duty of care helps protect the church from liability. So it absolutely is a program that benefits all of us. So once you've assessed your program and decide to proceed, this is when screening comes in. And a lot of times in the church, we're reluctant to screen volunteers. There can be a lot of reasons for that. It's a lot of work, and we're already all giving so much. We don't like to say no to our friends and family. Usually, we're desperate for volunteers and grateful to anyone who's willing to step up. And we're afraid that if we make it too hard, no one will volunteer. And I also think we have this idea that if we say no to someone, we're a church, and we are depriving people of doing something that they feel really called to do in a theological sense. We believe that the Holy Spirit works in ways we don't always understand, and we don't want to get in the way of that. But screening is about creating and maintaining a safe environment. And that always has to be our first priority. So this slide shows you the components of screening, and they are all described in fairly good detail in Faithful Footsteps. And I am going to talk more about some of the aspects of that when we go into breakout rooms. So if you're wanting to talk more in depth about the components of screening, when we go into breakout rooms, if you stay here in the main room, we're going to go deeper into this topic and a couple of others. But I do want to just touch on a couple of key pieces around the components of screening. Specifically, I want to talk about police reference checks and what to do if you discover that someone has a criminal charge or a conviction. So we do an interview, we do reference checks, and then we do a police reference check, and it discloses that someone has had a conviction. So not every type of offense means that someone is not an appropriate volunteer. For example, if someone was convicted for participating in an environmental protest, that wouldn't necessarily preclude them from assuming a leadership role. When a criminal charge or conviction is disclosed or discovered, it is expected that the folks who are doing the screening will have further clarifying conversation. And that conversation should focus on how the nature of the conviction would affect a person's ability to perform the duties of the position. And we encourage you to exercise diligence, compassion, and wisdom to focus on the type of conviction and when it occurred, to understand all of the details around that and work together to assess whether or not it creates a risk. If someone was arrested for fraud, assault, or a sex-related offense, they should not hold a position of trust and authority. And I realize that there may be very rare situations in which there might be exceptional circumstances, but we should proceed with great caution, and please consult with regional staff if you find yourself having that conversation. In most situations, it is true that a person convicted of assault or a sex-related crime should not hold a position that gives them access and power over vulnerable people. This doesn't mean that they can't be a member of our community. We are an Easter people. We believe in resurrection and new life, forgiveness and redemption, and we follow the teachings of Jesus, who calls on us to protect and care for those who are vulnerable. And that always has to take priority. If you have someone in your community of faith who has a documented history of being violent or sexually abusive, your due diligence requires you to have a plan which contains clear boundaries around their participation in the community. And the person needs to be aware of the plan and agree to the plan in writing. This keeps them safe from reoffending or being accused of reoffending, and it keeps others safe from their behavior. It can be done with a small group of trusted church leaders who form a circle of support around the person, who may continue to participate in your community, but not in a role of trust and authority. If in the course of conducting your due diligence, you learn that there is someone in your community of faith that you need to support in this way, and you want help creating a plan, please reach out to any one of your regional staff. Now, screening volunteers or staff gives those involved in the process access to a great deal of personal information through interviews, references, and most particularly through police record checks. It may be tempting to share that information more broadly in the congregation out of a misunderstanding of what duty of care means. But in fact, you need to have really clear expectations about the confidential nature of this information, who needs to have access to it, and how it will be stored. Out of respect for the people involved, this information needs to be kept strictly confidential. However, communication about the policy and process of duty of care should be shared broadly in the congregation so that people understand that this is a general best practice and not an attack on any one person. So, Faithful Footsteps provides a lot of detail about each of the steps in the screening process, and along with that, it provides sample questions for use in risk assessments. It provides screening checklists and sample forms and letters. It is a resource that we recommend every community of faith should read and implement. And if you have questions at any point in that process, I encourage you to reach out to the other resource that is available to you, and this is your regional staff. And I will also put all of these email addresses into the chat box. But as you can see, there's a number of us who are available to help you in doing this conversation. I'm about to pass the baton to Melody, but I just wanted to acknowledge some of the topics that we haven't talked about. And these are big conversations, and we will have further opportunities to talk about these topics. And again, I am going to put some links into the chat. I'm going to wait because I'm almost done. I'll put them in after I finish. But accessibility is part of duty of care, and the United Church has great resources for that. We are going to offer a boundary training for lay leaders. The United Church offers training. It is more specifically for ministry personnel, and we want to focus on our lay leaders and our volunteers. The United Church has a number of resources related to health and safety, and one of the pieces I do want to have another conversation about is around checklists for church safety and church inspection of our property, because that is another really key area of duty of care. We had a couple of questions about rental and lease agreements and how we engage with other users of our church building. That's another topic we want to talk about. Social media and our online presence. As we engage one another more and more online, our duty of care in that space is really critical. Workplace violence and workplace discrimination, harassment, and violence. I just want to say that by law, you're required to have a policy that addresses harassment, discrimination, and violence in the workplace. The United Church has one. I'm going to put the link in the chat. And communities of faith may use our United Church policy or develop your own customized policy. But if you're going to develop your own, the procedure for complaints must be the same as the United Church policy. And in addition, it must comply with provincial or territorial legislation related to discrimination, harassment, and violence. And as Diane mentioned, we're also going to give you an opportunity to let us know about other topics that you would like to learn more about. Whew, that was a lot of information from me, and we will have an opportunity to chat more when we go into breakout rooms, but for now, I'm going to pass it to Melody.
Well, good evening, everyone, and thank you so much, Jody, for your conversation this evening. I'm going to pick up the baton, as you mentioned, and just as we get started, I'm going to put in the chat, and probably will be the same addresses that Jody's putting in, but this is the website where a lot of these policies reside on United Church of Canada website. So it gives me great joy to join you this evening. As you heard already, my name is Melody. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm joining you this evening from Sudbury, Ontario, where I serve Canadian Shield Regional Council as a support to communities of faith minister, but I also serve both regional councils in my capacity as support for stewardship. So I'm seeing lots of folks that I have come in contact with in lots of different capacities. So I'm glad to be joining you. And this evening, I'm going to be discussing the sexual misconduct prevention and response policy and procedures of the United Church of Canada as they relate to lay leaders. So give me a moment to get lined up here. And I hope everyone can see this. Can everyone see? Great, excellent. And I'm just going to get small here. So, as a safe environment is one that fosters healthy relationships that's free of harassment of any kind. And harassment in these conversations is any unwanted conduct that is known or ought to be reasonably known to be unwanted. And it is a form of discrimination. The United Church of Canada does not tolerate harassment or sexual misconduct of any kind. In the United Church of Canada, we talk about the ministry of safe space through a number of our policies and resources. And tonight we're taking a look at one of those policies, the Sexual Misconduct Prevention and Response Policy and Procedures, which was just revised in 2020. But as I mentioned already, I put into the chat the web page that includes a number of different policies, including the ones that Jody spoke about already. And one that I do want to draw attention to as well that kind of fits in with some of these policies at the Youth Ministry Code of Ethics resource. The policy and procedures apply not only to ministry personnel and employees, but also to members, adherents, volunteers, and to any other person who is carrying out a responsibility or an activity on behalf of the United Church of Canada. The Sexual Misconduct Prevention and Response Policy is not intended, does not apply to be used for complaints that might be brought between members or adherents of a congregation unless one of those parties is in a position of power with respect to the other person. And this policy also applies to camps and other bodies that have direct affiliation with the United Church of Canada and have adopted this policy. In all cases, when there is a complaint against a person within any of these bodies, these complaints are to be directed to the board of directors or its designate of the camp or the other affiliated bodies. So as lay leaders in the church, it's really important to know that laity are held to the same accountability as paid staff and ministry personnel. And these are the latest records that we have up until 2018 that I was able to access today. Believe me, I checked a lot of folks. But just a note that in this time period, over 1/3 of complaints have been directed to and at lay leadership. So don't think that if you're a layperson that you don't fall under this policy. If you are in a role of in a position, a trusted position, a role of authority, you are covered by this policy. This does pertain to you. Now, leadership carries with it power, authority, and trust. And whether we are paid accountable ministers or lay leaders, we need to understand how we carry all three of those gifts. Now, some of us were called into leadership in the church and were set aside and designated as trustworthy presence among our people. And in this leadership role, we have power and authority intended to be used to support the church's ministry and the individuals we serve. When we betray that trust by taking advantage of the vulnerability of someone who seeks our help, it is a particularly extreme form of sexual misconduct. This misconduct undermines the integrity of the whole ministry and the whole church. The hospitality code that we learned from the Jewish and Christian traditions mandates us to protect the vulnerable among us and offer healing and restoration. So therefore, the Sexual Misconduct Prevention and Response Policy has zero tolerance of behaviors that inappropriately cross boundaries. It is the responsibility of the person in a leadership role to maintain and ensure that appropriate boundaries are maintained. It's the church's responsibility to ensure that those offering leadership on its behalf are aware of this policy and understand it. So under this idea of zero tolerance, there is no tolerance for unwanted sexual attention in the form of remarks, jokes, or innuendo about a person's body, clothing, or sexual activity. There is no tolerance of unnecessary physical contact, such as touching, patting, pinching, punching, or physical assault. There is no tolerance of language that is demeaning of sexual identity, gender, or sexual orientation, or gender orientation. There is no tolerance of indirect or explicit invitations to engage in sexual activities, which may include a promise of reward for complying or a threat of reprisal for not complying. In our activities as leaders, we need to pay attention to how we respect personal space. We need to pay attention to our own understandings and the understanding of power and boundaries that we are to maintain. And we are to pay attention to the sexualization of interactions. This policy does also include the inappropriate use of social media and technological communication. It covers the use of inappropriate language or innuendo in text messages, the use of or request for pictures that infer sexualization, the sexualization of language or innuendo in tweets or emails or other social media. One of the complexities of leadership in the church is that we often have a duplicity of relationships with people. By that I mean we have duplicate relationships with people. We might be their youth leader, but we're also their neighbor, or their parent, or their relative, or co-participant in a local theater group. It's important to understand, though, that once we are given a leadership role within the church, it is not something that we stop doing or being when we leave the church event. If the relationship with someone has been established through our role as a leader, we carry the accountability of that role with us. As an example, it's not only misconduct for a youth leader to send a sexualized text during a youth event to a participant. It would be equally misconduct to send it a week later from home while you're gaming or watching a movie. And this is something in particular, especially as we welcome younger people into leadership roles, we have to be really clear about the fact that we do not turn our leadership roles on or off. If we've been in a leadership role and a relationship with another person, even if we are not currently exercising leadership responsibilities, we continue to be held accountable to the boundaries appropriate to that leadership. Another example might be the chair of the council, who is not only a leader during the meetings or when physically in the church building. A youth group leader is not only a leader during the gathering or the event or at worship, continues to be a youth leader afterwards as well. If the relationship is with another person is established because of the role you have, then that defines the nature of the relationship. In this conversation, we need to be aware of what consent is. And consent is a voluntary agreement to engage in an activity by an individual who is in a position to make that choice. There is no consent that can be given when a complainant submits or does not or just doesn't resist by reason of force or threats or fear, or by the exercise of authority. Someone says, I'm telling you what to do because I'm the leader, or through fraud, or where the respondent is in a position of trust with the complainant, or where the complainant is a legal minor. And then there is also the breaking of the Criminal Code of Canada. Consent is not only about whether the complainant has been forced to do something, but also whether, because of the position of the leadership the complainant has, that trusted that person that it would be acceptable. So I hope you understand what I'm saying with that. I'm including in the PowerPoint slides tonight the process for how a complaint would be addressed within a congregation as it relates to a layperson, which is different from that of a paid accountable ministry personnel. And in the case of a layperson, the conversation needs to be very quickly related to the regional council. In the case of a paid accountable ministry staff person, it goes through the Office of Vocation. But in this case, it goes through the regional council, pastoral relations. So there is a process, and you can take a look at that in closer detail in the policy itself. One of the things that I did want to outline, though, that there are options that are possible that can be appropriate responses to a complaint. And some of those responses can be different if the layperson is an employee of the church. So there could be progressive discipline up to and including the termination of their position. Or they could be invited to participate in a directed program. If the respondent is a member or an adherent or in a position of responsibility as a layperson, there could be a wide variety of actions taken by the congregational governing body that might include things like removing or suspending that person from their leadership position. It could mean that they be removed from membership. There could be limitation on their participation, supervision in church activities. Once the process concludes, there is no appeal from a decision. The community of faith bears the costs of investigation. However, very quickly in the process, your regional council support is brought to bear. And all records and related materials are kept confidential, except as provided for in the policy and procedures and required by law. in every case where there's a complaint made and an investigation conducted, there's always an effort to be made to restore relationships, whether or not there's further action required. Sometimes that can be really challenging. And I know that Jody referred to some of this in her earlier presentation, that the policy, if you take a look at it, does refer to and suggest some support and assistance that can help us to restore a relationship. But it's important to know that wounds that have been experienced as a result of an event sometimes need to be cared for in very, very intentional ways. Having clear communication provided, not necessarily about confidential information about policy and procedures, is very important. And it is expected that information shared within the scope of an investigation will be held in confidence. Counseling might be offered for all the parties involved in a process. There might be different groups and committees that need to have different levels of communication in response to the situation, which may include the Ministry and Personnel Committee. You might need, if such a situation occurs, there may need to be some intentionality around debriefing. And your regional council can provide information about trauma support that might be able to come and work with you in the congregation and the affected group and help find a way forward together. Now, included on this slide are a number, again, of online resources, as I mentioned, including the Code of Ethics for Youth Ministry, and also another helpful resource, which is the Faith Trust Institute. And so I think I'm turning it back to, I believe it's Jody. I'm going to stop sharing now. And for the continuing on with our conversation.
Thanks. And I think the links that I posted didn't get posted as links because I was trying to do it too fast. So I will post them again. What we're going to do at this point is we're going to go into some breakout rooms. And we took a look at a lot of the questions that had been sent to us and tried to create breakout rooms that would address as many of them as possible. There is a breakout room with Diane that's going to focus on COVID protocols. We had a lot of questions about that. And one with Melody that is going to focus on financial best practices, trustees, and property. Jeffrey Dale is going to do a breakout room that's related to outreach ministries and mental health awareness. And Todd McDonald is going to host a breakout room that is going to involve Ministry and Personnel Committee questions, staff, and licensed lay worship leaders. And if you want to continue the conversation about more general duty of care, and if we have time, I also want to talk about pastoral visitation programs. I'm going to stay here in the main room. Okay, so we are the group that is talking about, as Carolyn just mentioned, we can do some conversation about pastoral visitation and some duty of care best practices, but also I wanted to open it up if there were questions about any of the information we were talking about related to risk assessment, risk management, and screening. So I'm just going to pause for a second to see, and if you can either put a question in the chat, or you can put your hand up virtually, or you can just wave at me. Oh, I've been spotlighted again. Oh, so there's Marty. Marty, what's your question?
My question is, when do we involve the police?
Oh, that's a really interesting question.
Because I'm looking at the Catholic Church and all the cover-ups. And I looked at your process and thought, where how do you determine when do you because I was a teacher, and CAS and police were number one.
Yes. So absolutely, if you have any reason to believe that a vulnerable person is being harmed, you need to contact the police. My recommendation would be contact one of us in the regional staff and let's talk it through so that you don't have to make that decision alone, because we can help you sort it out depending on the individual circumstances.
Okay, thank you.
Cindy Brownlee.
I would like to know, I'd like a little information about developing policies. We have a safe church policy at our church that it's sort of a bit of mishmash of activities, and I'd like to clean it up a little bit and, incorporate all of these documents you've discussed today. But I wondered if there would be any policy assistance.
Absolutely. So a couple of things I'll tell you. First of all, if you're really keen on policy, and who isn't among us?
I love
really,
policy.
This book is actually quite helpful because it starts each section of the conversation by saying, here's what your policy should look like around this, and here's what your best practices should look like. That being said, if that's heavy reading for folks, again, happy to have a chat with anyone who's working on a policy. Happy to look at the policy with you and talk through how to word it. I do feel like if your focus is health and safety, there is a sample health and safety policy on the United Church's website, and I think I got that link into the chat again, so that would work. If you're thinking about the screening, the Faithful Footsteps really does walk you through that. But again, I or Melody or Diane would be happy to offer that kind of support.
Okay, perfect. Thank you.
Yeah. Other questions?
Jody, there's a question in chat
yes.
From Tay Madison. What role does the church have for duty of care with regards to organizations that use our church and their clients, such as food banks, scouts, etc.?
Yeah, so that is a question that has been raised, and I think I think that's a topic we need to explore a bit more. I'm not confident at this point to offer an answer, and I'd like to do some research on that. So stay tuned and know that I've heard that question, but I don't like to give advice that I'm not confident in. So
I would incorporate that answer into the policies.
Yes. Yes. Are there other questions around that? Well, we can continue that conversation, but I did also hear that there was some interest in pastoral visitors, and I do want to share some information from that. So I'm just going to go back. Nope, that's not what I want. This is what I want. As our population ages, and with a lot of the ways that our circumstances have changed over the last few years and our concerns increasing about health, it's challenging for some folks to participate in church events, and some people, particularly elderly people, feel isolated. And so pastoral visits have become even more important as a way to stay in touch, but they do have their own duty of care concerns, and it did seem like an important place to focus some attention. So I did do some research around this, and some of the best practices that were provided in the Plan to Protect book include always arrange the visit in advance and have a clear starting time. And that's not necessarily something that we would think about. We think we can drop in. It's lovely to go visit someone, but it's helpful to arrange the visit in advance. And when possible, visit in pairs with another trained visitor. Or if that's not possible, if you just don't have that number of volunteers, try to make sure that there's a caregiver present or that you're visiting in a public space. So if a pastoral care visitor was going to visit my mom in her retirement home, it might be appropriate to go into one of the sunrooms or down into one of the main areas where there's lovely sitting areas and you can just sit and have a visit. Be respectful of people's time and energy, especially if they're elderly or ill. Keep the pastoral care purpose of your visit in mind at all times. And like that includes don't attempt or appear to attempt to be influencing a person, particularly someone who might be confused or have some cognitive issues. Don't offer advice, for example, on their medicine or their medical treatment or their finances or family relationships. Just really keep the focus on chatting about things that are happening in the church, things that are happening in their day, the movement of the seasons, things that can be uplifting and encouraging, but don't get into that gray area of unwanted advice. Never initiate inappropriate or unwanted touch. It is. I'm not saying don't hold someone's hand if they want to hold your hand, because that can be a really important connection for folks. But just make sure. Melody talked about consent. Just make sure that the touch is wanted and that it's not misunderstood. And when you're sitting with someone, choose a seat that's a comfortable distance from the person so they can see and hear you, but you're not too close. And if possible, avoid going into a person's bedroom unless there's another person there, and preferably only if that person is bedridden. If you can't visit in an open space or with other people, please make sure to keep the door open if at all possible. So all things that don't create a sense of inappropriate interaction. And in terms of your own safety as well, don't agree to meet someone in their home if you're concerned about your own safety, if it's someone you don't know well. Arrange to meet in a public location. And if you do go to someone's home, when you first arrive, assess the situation. Don't continue to stay if the person is inappropriately dressed or under the influence of alcohol or drugs, or if that person or their animal is acting in a threatening or aggressive manner, and particularly if the animal isn't contained. If you don't feel safe, politely excuse yourself and leave. Schedule a visit on an alternate day and possibly at a different location. So your safety is as important as the safety of the person you're visiting. If someone says or does things that makes you feel uncomfortable or unsafe, tell them to stop and reestablish appropriate boundaries. They may not be aware that their behavior is making you uncomfortable. But if the behavior continues, again, leave the situation, document what happened, and tell the person who's in charge of your program. Keep information that's shared with you in a pastoral visit confidential, unless you're required by law to disclose it, or you feel that that person is at risk of harm. And then again, you would talk to the person in charge of your program and or seek advice from regional council staff. And unless the purpose of the visit is explicitly stewardship, and even then I would be hesitant, but don't accept gifts or donations from someone during a pastoral visit. Encourage them to mail their donation directly to the church, or if they're able to donate online. But don't take away a person's donation. And if you are visiting with someone and you are concerned about their well-being, if you're concerned about their ability to care for themselves, if you're concerned that they are at risk of harm, again, speak to the person in charge of your program about possibly reaching out to a family member to ensure that the person is receiving the care that they need. So those are a few best practices around pastoral visitation that I think would be we'd all be well advised to take. And again, and I'm sorry, I can't remember who it was who asked about the policy, but those best practices would be very easy to shape into a policy around pastoral visitation if that was something you were inclined to do. I'm going to again remove my spotlight so that I can see if anyone has any questions about that. Carolyn.
Not a question, just a comment. You
Sure.
mentioned not to give advice or direction to someone that you're visiting, particularly if it's a medical issue that crops up. I would also add that volunteers shouldn't be giving any medications.
Yes,
and be very careful if you are agreeing to have a cup of tea, for example, and a cookie, that person can actually have that. Always make sure with their caregiver what the limitations are.
Thank you, Carolyn. That's really good. That's really good advice as well. And I think we could welcome best practices from others in the group as well. And the food one, I think, is an important piece. Also, if you are, and this was a question that came in, if you're taking food to someone, you want to be sure that anything you're taking, they are able to eat. And if you're not sure and you're not confident that they can accurately give you the information, that might not be a good choice, because you don't want to risk causing harm through a food allergy or and that could be quite serious too. A couple of other things as I was scooching through my slides, I realized there was a couple of other things that I wanted to go into more depth on with the screening processes. So I'll just pause if there were other questions around pastoral visiting, but if not, I did want to touch on, I'm looking, I realize I can't see page 2, but I'm confident that Donna and Kathleen are watching too, so that's good. One of the pieces that was identified in the in Faithful Footsteps for screening is creation of a job description. And I did want to just speak to that a little bit, because I know that can feel like an onerous task to create a position description, but and we don't always associate them with volunteer positions, but I do want to encourage you to really think about that for positions that you're going to be filling for leading programs, because they do help to define those boundaries and guidelines for the task and for the roles, and also help to define and identify the risks that are inherent in the position. And so again, a clear position description is going to protect your volunteers by formalizing the roles. And it's also going to send a clear message to any potential abuser that the safety of participants is a primary value for your community of faith. And I think that's true too of a robust screening process in general. It sends that message that we're taking this seriously. And I think that's a really important message. And I did want to share with you, and sorry, I'm going to just share my screen again, because I wanted to share with you a resource that was shared with us by my colleague, Kathy Douglas, in the 3 regions to the west of us. And I just wanted you to see that this is a template she uses to help create a job description for a volunteer. And so you can see it doesn't necessarily have to be an onerous task. You can create it using this template and fill in the details. And this is something that we can make available for folks if it would be a useful tool for you. And the other thing that I wanted to go a little bit more in depth on, again, related to the sorry, I got to find my notes. I got too many screens. Related to the police records check, and we talked a little bit earlier about what to do if a conviction is disclosed. But I think it's important that we also understand a couple of things about it. A police records check really is mainly for positions that are going to be in direct service roles, directly providing programs for folks. You don't necessarily have to get a PRC for every volunteer in your community of faith. So if somebody is on your Christian education committee, you might not need a PRC for them, but if they're teaching Sunday school, it would probably be a good idea. It does require written permission to seek a PRC, and I think that if someone refuses permission, that would be a red flag, and you'd want to have a conversation about why they're refusing permission. And the other piece is to identify that there are, in fact, limitations of a police records check. They're only good up to the day of the checking, so you should schedule how often you'll repeat these police record checks, perhaps every 3 years. The individual may have used a false name or a false birth date, so there are no matches found when a check is done. If the conviction occurred when the person was a youth, the information is protected under the Young Offenders Act. And some folks have just never been convicted, so there will be no record to uncover. And so that's why we say that a police record check is one tool, but it's not the only tool. That's why the risk assessment piece is so important, and the risk management, and having a policy that says these are our best practices around our programs. Because if we think, oh, we've done a police record check, we've done everything we needed, we may still miss some. That was just another piece that I wanted to go a little bit more in depth on for folks. I feel like I've been talking a lot, just checking again to see if there are questions or other comments folks have.
There's a comment in chat, Jody, I think,
yeah.
if you want to read it out.
So in many programs, there are lots of activity helpers who do things like set up for coffee, set up tables, fetch supplies, and clean up. We call them volunteers, but it sounds like we would not need to do role descriptions for all of these small roles. So my recommendation would be that you have some general expectations for all of the helpers. And they might be as simple as, don't go into a room alone with a participant and close the door. Generally, none of our helpers should be doing that, and don't engage in inappropriate conversation or touching. You could do some general guidelines that would apply to all of them. I don't think you need to break it down to individual roles. And I mean, your guidelines are going to be very similar for pretty much any position you have. Around a lot of the pieces that we talked about, the inappropriate touching, the don't be alone in a room with an individual, that sort of thing. They're going to be fairly consistent. But I do think it's important to have some guidelines. Any other? Oh, Marty.
Some of you touched briefly about the other groups, and somebody asked about other groups. Some of the groups have their policy already. Would it be upon us to ask to see their policies?
So again, I don't feel qualified yet to offer that advice. I think that could be a best practice. Stay tuned. One of the things I have learned, a hard lesson, is don't say things unless you're very sure that you know what you're talking about. As I think we've identified that we've really just scratched the surface on some of this conversation, and it feels very timely, particularly because we're coming back from lockdown and we're thinking about how to do this relationship, this community well. So I hope as folks are coming back in from their breakout rooms, I hope that all of the conversations were rich and helpful, and that we'll continue to have those conversations together. And I'm just going to look and see if my colleague Diane.
I'm here.
Oh, perfect. I am going to pass the mic to you.
Thank you so much, Jody. Before we part ways for this evening, I want to say a special thank you to the wonderful admin staff, Kathleen and Donna, who did such a terrific job of handling the intensity of registration for this event, who did a great job of communicating, who hosted us wonderfully this evening. Thank you so much, Kathleen and Donna, and a happy early Administrative Professionals Day to you both. We are so grateful for all you do. I want to thank Jody and Melody for really thoughtful and thought-provoking workshops. Jeffrey and Todd, thank you for hosting breakout conversations and for all the ways that you're supporting duty of care in our regions. Mostly though, I want to thank all of you for your questions, for your commitment, and for your caring for your communities of faith and for the people that we serve together. As I mentioned, an evaluation is going to go out in the coming days to gather feedback. Please let us know what you want to talk about next, because we want to keep the conversation going. To draw our time to an end, I want to share words with you from one of my favorite poems, Many Moons by Donna Ashworth. She's speaking about the human condition, but I think if we listen carefully, she's got some wisdom to offer to the church in this time of transition and uncertainty. Many moons waned and many suns rose before I learned that perfect is not found in unspoiled skin, or in the racing limb, or the well-stitched bag, or the shiny jewel, the glittering career, or money in the bank. It is found in the love and nowhere else. As we go into this night, my friends, may we do so knowing that we are held in the most perfect love of the one who knit us together. And may we love and care for each other as Jesus, our shepherd and friend, has first cared for us. Go in love, my friends.